On a quiet Sunday afternoon, a single mother shared her picnic with a silent, weathered stranger in the park. She thought she was offering him a sandwich. What she didn't know was that she was handing hope to a man the world had presumed dead for over a decade. Within the hour, helicopters roared overhead, soldiers stormed the grass, and secrets long buried rose to the surface. Who was this man? Why had an entire military been quietly searching for him? And how could one small act of kindness unravel a mystery 10 years in the making? This is a story of the bench, the meal, and the moment that changed everything. On the outskirts of Glendale, a sleepy Midwestern town wrapped in golden fields and the hush of familiarity, Sundays held a special kind of magic for Emily Richardson and her 7-year-old daughter, Lily. They were sacred, uninterrupted by screens, untouched by errands, just mother and daughter, laughter and quiet moments stitched together beneath the wide sky. That Sunday, the sun hung low, warm and forgiving, casting dapple light through the sprawling branches of their favorite oak tree in Riverside Park. Emily spread out a well-worn blanket and unpacked their picnic basket, filled with turkey sandwiches, sliced strawberries, and lemonade in mason jars. Lily giggled as a butterfly landed briefly on her knee. Then Emily noticed him. 30 yards away, on a weathered bench by the path, sat a man who didn't quite belong to the scene. His silver beard was wild, but trimmed enough to show he hadn't given up completely. His jacket was worn thin at the elbows, yet clean. His posture was upright, military even, but his eyes, they didn't rest. They scanned. Not like someone enjoying a park, but like someone who couldn't stop seeing the battlefield beneath it. Lily followed her mother's gaze. "Mommy, why is that man all by himself?" Emily hesitated. The man had no lunch, no phone, no book, just a battered water bottle and a silence that seemed carved from pain. "I think he might be hungry," Emily replied gently. Lily nodded, already digging through the basket. "He can have my sandwich, the one with cheese." With her heart beating faster than she admitted, Emily stood and walked toward the bench. Around her, disapproving eyes narrowed. A woman in oversized sunglasses whispered to her husband. A father pulled his son toward the playground, casting a long, suspicious glance. Emily ignored them. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly. "My daughter and I brought more food than we can eat. Would you join us?" The man looked at her, not startled, not frightened, just measuring. Something in his eyes, something deep and long-suffering, blinked awake. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "We right over there," she continued, motioning to the tree. "Just sandwiches and lemonade, nothing fancy." He stood. The movement was slower than his eyes, but he carried himself like a man who had once walked with command. The blanket, Lily's face lit up. "Ha! I picked the best one for you." He took the sandwich as if accepting a medal, hands trembling slightly. He didn't thank her. He didn't need to. Emily understood the weight of that kind of silence. From a nearby table, a sharp voice pierced the moment. "Can you believe she's letting her kid eat with a man like that?" Emily's shoulders stiffened, but she didn't react. Instead, she poured a third cup of lemonade and offered it calmly. "Mommy," Lily whispered, "why does he look so sad?" Emily turned her gaze toward him. The scars on his hands, the way he watched the treetops instead of the people. "Maybe," she said softly, "because it's been a very long time since anyone just sat with him." And for a few minutes, that was all they did. They sat, they shared a meal, no past, no judgment, just a little girl handing lemonade to a man the world had forgotten. As the final crumbs of their lunch disappeared, the silence between them deepened, not heavy, but reflective, like the air after a storm that never quite broke. The man sat with his back straighter now, his hands resting on his knees, breathing more evenly, though his eyes still carried a weight that defied words. And without a sound, he reached into the inner pocket of his faded jacket. What he pulled out wasn't much, just a square of folded fabric frayed at the edges, stained with time. He unfolded it with care as though each crease held meaning. Emily leaned slightly forward. Embroidered in worn but unmistakable stitching were the words, "4th Marine Recon Task Force Echo." At the center was an insignia she didn't recognize, but the gravity in the man's posture told her all she needed to know. My father was a Marine, Emily offered gently, her voice dipping into a memory of her own. He didn't speak much about it. I always wondered what he carried, too. The man looked at her then, really looked, something kind breaking through the stoic surface. I was there, he said finally. Then I wasn't. The words hung in the air, incomplete but whole in their sorrow. Lily, with the earnestness only a child could muster, pointed to a white scar barely visible on his wrist. Did you get hurt? Emily opened her mouth to gently scold, but the man only gave the faintest shake of his head. Long time ago, he replied. Sometimes the outside heals faster than the inside. From behind them, someone laughed, a brittle sound, more mockery than joy. Emily turned and saw the man from earlier, the one who had pretended to take a selfie. He wasn't pretending anymore. His phone was angled deliberately at them. He snapped another photo, grinning as he walked away to show it to a small group near the playground. Their laughter followed like a cold breeze. The man beside her shifted, subtle but sharp. His fingers closed around the patch, folding it swiftly, almost protectively, like tucking a part of himself back into the shadows. I'm sorry, Emily said softly, her hand instinctively reaching out, but stopping just short. Would you like more lemonade before you go? For a long second, he said nothing. Then, with quiet resignation, he nodded once. She poured, he drank. And in that moment, something strange happened. A jogger ran by, shirt clinging with sweat, the words Marine Corps emblazoned across his chest. He barely glanced at the picnic until he saw the patch in the man's hand, caught mid-fold before it vanished again. He stopped, turned, looked again, slowed his jog, eyes narrowing, brow furrowing in disbelief. His pace picked up, not toward them, but away, but with urgency now. Emily noticed. She said nothing. Unseen by her, that jogger, Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams was already pulling out his phone as he jogged up the hill. By the time he reached his car, he had posted a message to a private veterans group. Possible sighting of Cole Jason Reed. Not 100% certain, but the TF Echo patch is rare and unmistakable. Glendale, Riverside Park, can anyone confirm? Meanwhile, the photo taken by the Mockerman was already circling local social media. Its caption was meant to ridicule. When single moms start adopting stray veterans, you rock bad choices. But when it reached a closed military forum, the tone shifted instantly. My God, that's him. That's Jason Reed. In under 20 minutes, the image was being analyzed by a secure team of intelligence officers who hadn't uttered the name Jason Reed in years because they'd been told he died in 2008 along with the rest of Task Force Echo. Only, what the world didn't know, what even most military personnel weren't allowed to know, was that Reed had survived. The mission he led had failed catastrophically. A decision made in the heat of fire saved some lives but cost others. Officially, it was a black mark, a buried incident no one was supposed to talk about. Unofficially, for those who served under him or lost sons and brothers on that mission, he became a ghost. A man both honored and judged, revered and resented, hunted and missed. After the fallout, Colonel Jason Reed disappeared. No credit cards, no VA benefits, no contact. He walked away from medals and mourning alike, carrying guilt like a rucksack filled with stones. And now, 10 years later, he'd been found, not by satellite nor surveillance, nor armed forces, by a third-grade teacher and her daughter offering a sandwich beneath an oak tree. Emily, still unaware of the ripples she'd set in motion, began packing up the picnic. The sky had softened, the sun dipping lower. Lily gathered napkins and plastic cups, humming quietly. Before they left, the man reached once more into his pocket. This time, he pulled out a small wooden object, roughly carved, delicate in its simplicity, a bird mid-flight. For you, he said, offering it to Lily with hands steadier than before. Lily took it with wonder. Did you make this? He gave a small nod. Carried it a long time. Think it belongs here now. Emily's heart ached in ways she couldn't explain. There were no ranks, no salutes, just a broken man and a little girl who saw through every layer of the world's noise. And in that quiet offering, the weight of a decade began to lift. The air was still, the kind of calm that comes just before something breaks. Emily held Lily's hand as they gathered their belongings, their picnic nearly over, unaware that far above them, rotors had already begun to slice through the sky. Exactly 58 minutes after that photograph was posted in a military forum, the calm of Riverside Park shattered. At first, it was just a distant thrum. Curious heads turned upward. Then came the unmistakable sound, low, deep, and growing louder, of a military grade helicopter approaching at speed. Children stopped mid-glade, parents stood shielding their eyes, birds scattered from the trees, and then it appeared, a black hawk, sleek and dark against the fading sky, hovering over the open field near the picnic area. The wind roared across the grass. Paper plates flew, napkins tumbled, tree branches bent violently. Panic rippled through the park as people began to scatter, shielding their children and rushing for cover. Emily instinctively pulled Lily to her chest and crouched beside the oak, shielding her from the force of the wind. Her heart raced. Her instinct screamed to run, but something in her told her not to move. 4 uniformed soldiers descended from the helicopter before it even fully touched the ground. They moved with precision, boots landing with thuds of absolute intent. Behind them stepped out a 5th figure, taller, older, dressed in full ceremonial uniform. The sun caught the metals on his chest like fire catching glass. Lily clung tighter. "What's happening, Mommy?" "I don't know, sweetheart," Emily whispered, shielding her daughter with one arm as they watched the soldiers fan out. They scanned the crowd with purpose, eyes sharp, movements exact, no panic, only focus. Then their eyes found him. The man who had only moments earlier shared a sandwich on a blanket stood now at full height. His shoulders straightened, posture transforming as if summoned back into the body he once knew. The years that weighed on him seemed to fall away in that instant. The officer approached with solemn grace. He stopped exactly 2 paces from the man and, in a single fluid motion, saluted. "Colonel Jason Reed, sir," he said, his voice firm, echoing across the silent crowd. "Lieutenant Colonel David Hayes, Marine Special Operations Command. Permission to escort you home, sir?" Gasps rippled across the park. The man nodded once, slowly. His voice, steadier than before, carried its own gravity. "I assumed no one was still looking." "10 years, sir," Hayes replied. "We never stopped." And somewhere nearby, Emily's breath caught in her chest, not from fear, but from realization. The man they had shared lunch with was not a stranger. He was a soldier, a leader, a hero the world had given up on. From the descending helicopter, another figure emerged, older, walking with a limp that told of old wounds, both physical and otherwise. He wasn't in uniform, but he didn't need to be. Every inch of his bearing spoke of command, of battles fought and losses endured. His eyes locked on Reed immediately, and something deep, almost primal, shifted in his expression. "Jason." His voice cracked on the single name. He took 2 steps forward, then stopped, his shoulders trembling from restraint. Reed stiffened but did not retreat. "General Ryder!" "I'm not here as your superior," the man said, voice breaking again. "I'm here as the father of Captain Michael Ryder, the last man you saved before the extraction failed." There was no need for more. The air thickened with memory, with ghosts that had walked beside Reed for a decade. Emily, standing nearby with Lily, felt the weight of grief and grace unfolding before her, something too sacred to interrupt. Ryder stepped forward and placed a weathered hand on Reed's shoulder. "You didn't disappear because you were weak. You did it because you carried what no man should carry alone." Reed blinked slowly, and for the first time, his eyes filled, not from shame, but release. 2 soldiers approached Emily with quiet reverence. One of them, a young lieutenant, spoke gently. "Ma'am, your kindness today accomplished what military intelligence couldn't manage in 10 years." "I didn't do anything special," Emily said, almost embarrassed. "We just shared a meal." "No," the soldier replied. "You saw him, really saw him, when the rest of the world looked past him." Hayes turned to her and added, "He's the only one who can give closure to 8 families still living in shadows." You reminded him he wasn't just a ghost. As Colonel Reed turned toward the waiting helicopter, he paused. His eyes found Emily and Lily. "Thank you." 2 words, weighted with 10 years of silence, carried by the wind, but etched forever in their memory. In the days that followed, news of the park extraction spread like wildfire. Helicopter footage taken by startled onlookers made the local news, then national headlines, but Emily declined every interview request. "This isn't my story to tell," she said simply. "I was just there when someone needed a seat at the table." The military held a private ceremony at Quantico for the families of the Lost Task Force ECHO members. For the first time in 10 years, they heard what had truly happened in the final moments of their loved ones' lives, told not through debriefings or cold reports, but by the man who had lived it and carried their memory every step since. Colonel Reed didn't wear his uniform that day, but he stood with a quiet strength that only comes from surviving something no one else could fully understand. He didn't seek redemption, he offered truth. And for many, that was enough. Emily received a formal letter from the Marine Corps 1 week later. Inside was a note penned by General Ryder himself. "You reminded a broken warrior that he was still worthy of basic human kindness. In doing so, you helped bring peace to 8 grieving families." Enclosed was a small silver charm in the shape of an oak leaf, a quiet tribute to the tree under which lives had quietly shifted. That weekend, Emily and Lily returned to their usual spot in the park, but something was different now. In place of the old worn bench stood a freshly installed one, solid polished wood with a small bronze plaque. The kindness bench, where a mother taught her daughter the right thing to do. There were no helicopters overhead, no soldiers, just the spring breeze whispering through leaves and the soft rustle of lives being lived nearby. Lily skipped toward the bench, her charm dangling from her bracelet, catching the light like a quiet medal. Across the field, Emily noticed a young man sitting beside an elderly woman on the new bench. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. She handed him a bottle of water and he nodded in thanks. Another story beginning. The bench had become more than wood and metal. It was an invitation, a silent declaration that no one deserved to be invisible, that even a simple meal shared without judgment could stir echoes powerful enough to move a nation. That night, Lily asked, "Mommy, what does the leaf mean again?" Emily smiled, brushing her daughter's hair from her eyes. "It means," she said gently, "that some heroes don't wear uniforms anymore, but they still need someone to see them." Weeks passed. The park returned to its ordinary rhythms. Children laughed on swings, joggers resumed their loops, and families gathered for weekend lunches under open skies. But something beneath the surface had changed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't obvious. It lived in how people looked at one another a little longer, a little kinder. Emily began to notice quiet things. A young businessman, always alone with his phone, now stopped by the bench after work. Once, she saw him speaking softly with an elderly woman who held a grocery bag with trembling hands. Another time, a woman in scrubs sat beside a teenager with tear-streaked cheeks, neither saying much, just sitting, letting silence hold the space between them. The bench had become something sacred, not because of its wood or the plaque, but because of what it represented, a moment when the world didn't look away. One bright Saturday morning, a courier approached Emily while she and Lily unpacked another picnic. He handed her a small envelope, no return address, just her name, handwritten in steady, deliberate strokes. Inside was a letter, folded crisply, carefully. "For 10 years, no one truly saw me. I became invisible by choice, convinced I deserved nothing better. Then, on an ordinary Sunday, someone offered not just food, but dignity. Not with questions, not with pity, but with presence. You reminded me that I was still human, still worth something, even after I stopped believing it myself." Sometimes salvation doesn't come from grand speeches or battlefields. Sometimes it's just an extra sandwich and a place at the table. There is no adequate thanks for that. A grateful Marine. With it was a small, carefully wrapped charm, a second oak leaf. This one is etched with the letters TFE, Task Force Echo. Emily fastened it gently to Lily's bracelet, beside the first. "That one's for the people he couldn't save," she whispered. Lily looked up at her. "But he saved himself too, right?" Emily looked across the field to the bench, now occupied by two strangers, leaning toward one another in quiet conversation. "Yes," she said, "and maybe now he'll help others do the same." That night, after Lily fell asleep, Emily sat by the window and watched the wind stir the trees. And she thought about how sometimes the most powerful things we ever do are the ones no one claps for. No cameras, no medals. Just the quiet choice to sit beside someone when no one else will. Because sometimes all it takes is seeing the person no one else does and refusing to look away. And in doing so, we remind them and ourselves that no one is truly lost if someone still cares enough to stay. Colonel Jason Reed didn't disappear again. Not this time. After the private ceremony at Quantico, he was offered transport resources and housing, but he declined most. Instead, he asked for something simple, a quiet place near a lake, not far from the town where someone had finally seen him. But before he left, there was one more thing he had to do. It took place behind closed doors. 8 families were brought into a secure hall within a Marine base. Photographs of young men in uniform lined the front table. Sons, brothers, fathers, all lost during the mission that had defined Reed's silence. He stood before them, older, thinner, eyes hollowed by guilt, but lit now with purpose. What he gave them wasn't closure in the traditional sense. There were no happy endings, no tales of glory, but he gave them the truth, where their sons stood, how they fought, how they protected one another until the end, how it was his call, made in the chaos of blood and fire, that ensured some lived, though he could not save them all. Many cried, some sat in silence. A few walked forward, shook his hand, and said thank you, not because their grief was erased, but because the fog had finally lifted. Later that evening, sitting alone near the edge of the base, Reed received a visit. It was General Ryder again. "This part isn't easy," the older man said, sitting beside him. "Being seen again, coming back from being invisible." "I don't expect forgiveness," Reed replied quietly. "You already found something more important," Ryder said. "You found someone who looked at you and didn't flinch." Reed nodded. "She reminded me I wasn't done yet." "Then maybe," Ryder said, placing a steady hand on his shoulder, "you help the next man who feels the same way." Reed didn't answer. He simply looked out toward the water, where the light of the setting sun made it hard to tell where the lake ended and the sky began. For the first time in years, the weight on his chest didn't feel immovable. It felt carried. Not alone. Spring melted into summer. Then autumn came, painting the park in gold and rust. Seasons changed, but the bench remained, weathered slightly by wind and rain, but never empty for long. It wasn't just a place to rest anymore. It had become something more. People came alone and left with the company. Strangers struck up quiet conversations over coffee. Some sat in silence, holding grief they couldn't name, but feeling somehow that the bench could carry part of it for them. One afternoon, a teenage boy with headphones too big for his head sat down next to a woman twice his age. They didn't speak, but when she began to cry softly, he pulled one earbud out and handed it to her. She took it, and for a while the two listened to the same song without ever exchanging names. Another time, a young veteran sat rigid at one end of the bench, a dog tag in his hand. A mother with the stroller stopped briefly and placed a bottle of water beside him before continuing her walk. When she returned, the bottle was gone, and the man had moved closer to the sunlight. None of these moments were broadcast. No one took photos. No one went viral, but they mattered. Emily noticed them during her weekly visits with Lily. They still picnicked under the oak, just as they always had, but now others often joined them, people she once might have walked past without a second thought. One Sunday, Lily spotted an envelope taped gently to the bench. No name, no markings, just a message written in firm, careful penmanship. "If you are reading this, you are not alone. Someone has sat here before you and made it out of the dark. Let this space remind you that being seen is sometimes the first step toward healing." Tears stung Emily's eyes. As Lily ran ahead, chasing leaves, Emily sat down on the bench and closed her eyes. She didn't hear helicopters anymore. She heard the laughter of children, the steady breath of strangers finding peace, the quiet creak of the bench beneath the new weight, old stories, and shared humanity. Somewhere far off, Colonel Jason Reed had begun rebuilding not just his life, but his sense of purpose. Word had it he'd started volunteering at veteran outreach centers, quietly, anonymously. But now, when people spoke his name, it was no longer in whispers of speculation or shadows of shame. It's in gratitude. Because one woman and her daughter had reminded all of them that even forgotten heroes deserve a place at the table. The bench beneath the oak never asked questions. It never judged. It just stayed, waiting, welcoming, listening. And sometimes that was enough to change everything.